And about 2:30 or 3 o'clock in the morning, we got in a high-speed chase through the middle of town with a stolen car, and the driver wrecked it at the start of a city park, and the passenger bailed out one side, and this is summertime, and the driver took off the other direction, out the other side, and Floyd said, "You get that one, and I'll get this one." And now I've got tennis shoes, and I've got Levi's and a white t-shirt, and that's all I've got. Anyway, I chased this guy down, and I tackled him, and we got in a little bit of a scrap, and I won. And I convinced him that he needed to go back to the patrol car because he was going to get arrested. He had enough, and he walked back to the patrol car, and we waited for Floyd, and Floyd came back with his guy, and Floyd had them both cuffed up, and we took them off to jail. And I thought to myself, I said, you get to drive fast, which I like to do. You get to wear a gun and shoot a gun, and you get to fight. This is going to be a good career.
Old farts, good old farts, and there's nothing that we ain't done. Hiking, hunting, and fishing, we're still looking for more fun. So just sit back and listen. You don't want to be missing the adventures yet to be from folks like you and me.
Hey, it's Jim Huckabee again. Today, we're going to have a great time. We're going to chat with one of my older friends here in Washington. I was born here. I think we talked about that. Then came back about 40 years ago, 30 years ago, who knows. But after I came back, I met one of the game wardens who happened to be the sergeant here in the Kittitas Valley in central Washington. And I had known a lot of game wardens because I worked with Fish and Wildlife in Colorado for a number of years, doing some writing and other things for them. But I had a fondness for game wardens, and I had at one point thought maybe I would be one before I decided I'd rather be a college professor, or something decided that for me. Anyway, I got here, I met this guy, his name is Bill Essman, sitting right here. And Bill was the sergeant here in the valley. And one of the first things I noticed, we laughed as an easy laugh and so on and chatted for a while. But then I realized he was one of those really cool game wardens who had what I call the look. He could look at you when he was talking to you about rules, regulations, whatever, and just look at you. And you would want to start confessing things you had done when you were a kid. Every once in a while, I still meet game wardens who have that skill, but I'll never forget how much I appreciated and was terrified the first time I noticed that with Bill. But we've become good friends when he finally retired from Fish and Wildlife, Department of Fish and Wildlife here in Washington. We had this great party, and I got to MC it. It was really a kick. The whole world turned out to wish him well because he had that reputation. And so I'm going to let him tell you his own stories, and I'm going to talk about some of the things that he most remembers from his career. So, Bill, what a pleasure to hang out with you, sit with you. And so I guess we could start at the beginning. I interviewed a guy one time, and I said, so how did things start for you? And he said, well, like most people, I started life as a small child. And we all do that, I guess. But tell me about your career. What got you thinking you wanted to be a game warden or wanted to be in that part of law enforcement? Where did you serve? And just some of how you got started.
Jim, it was one of those careers that I decided I wanted to be a game warden when I was probably 12 or 14 years old. My mom and dad didn't hunt or fish, but my grandma and grandpa did, and I spent a lot of time with them. And my grandpa had grown up and grandma had grown up in eastern Washington in Okanagan County. And so we spent a lot of time up there. Anyways, I just loved the outdoors. I loved hunting and fishing. I liked the people I met. And Grandpa just beat it into me, so to speak, that you always followed the rules because animals didn't have a choice. So as hunters and fishermen, we had to follow the rules. When I was a senior in high school at career day, we had 2 old game wardens, probably 45 or 50. They seemed old at the time.
Yeah, old guys. Yeah.
Came and I attended their class and told me that I needed a 4-year degree in forestry to become a game warden. I didn't see how many board feet in a tree or what kind of a tree it was going to help me catch any poachers. But I started college, and after the first year, I was sure that was not going to help me. And so I had different jobs, and I turned 21. Just before I turned 21, one of my best friends, who was a year older, had gone to work for Longview PD. And he said, "You need to come out and ride with me." He said, he said, "You'd like this job." He said, "You'd be good at it." So I went out on a Saturday night in Longview Police Department in Western Washington, and I rode with Floyd. And anyway, we were working graveyard shift, and about 2:30 or 3 o'clock in the morning, we got in a high-speed chase through the middle of town with a stolen car, and the driver wrecked it at the start of a city park, Lake Sacagawea, and the passenger bailed out one side, and this is summertime, and the driver took off the other direction, out the other side, and Floyd said, "You get that one, and I'll get this one." And now I've got tennis shoes, and I've got 501 Wrangler or Levi's and a white T-shirt, and that's all I've got. Anyway, I chased this guy down, and I tackled him, and we got in a little bit of a scrap, and I won. And I convinced him that he needed to go back to the patrol car because he was going to get arrested. Anyway, he had enough, and he walked back to the patrol car, and we waited for Floyd, and Floyd came back with his guy, and Floyd had them both cuffed up, and we took them off to jail. And he said, or I thought to myself, I said, "You get to drive fast," which I like to do. You get to wear a gun and shoot a gun, and you get to fight. This is going to be a good career. So I started taking tests, and I took tests for Longview PD, Kelso PD, Cowlitz County Sheriff's Office, Lewis County Sheriff's Office, and then I came over the hill to Yakima County, Yakima PD, Wenatchee PD, Chelan County Sheriff, Okanagan County, Okanagan City, all before I was 21 years old. I was just shy of 21. When I turned 21 years old, I had 6 offers to come to work. And not sure I would enjoy it. I stayed at home. Kelso was the first one that offered me a job, first opening, that started immediately. So I quit my high-paying job at the Longview Fiber, where I was making a lot of money, and I went to work for Kelso PD, and I started out at $390 a month when I'd been bringing home $1,700 or $1,800 a month at the mill. Anyway, I got started in the Kelso PD, worked my way up to sergeant, and anyway, I met one of the new game wardens that came and said, "You don't need a 4-year degree in forestry. You don't need a 4-year degree. So you need a 2 years degree in law enforcement or 2 years of actually police experience." And he said, "You got it." In the meantime, I'd gone back to school and taken some law enforcement classes. I was in the 10th Basic Academy in the state of Washington, CJ, Criminal Justice Training Committee. So I already had that under my belt, and that wasn't even required for game wardens back then. And so he said, you ought to apply for our job. So shortly after I applied for, opening came up. And at that time, there was over 600 people applied for 10 positions, 10 game warden spots. And this was in 1975 in their original, in the Department of Game, Washington Department of Game. And anyway, I applied, I got an interview, and I got hired. And growing up in Longview, that was not very far from Seattle, but I'd never been to Seattle. The regional office, they stationed me in Auburn. So I moved from the Longview, Kelso, Castle Rock area to Auburn, which I'd never been to. I had to find my way down to, I believe it was on Fairview Avenue, downtown Seattle, which I'm sure his office probably isn't there anymore, but I thought that was the most traffic I had ever experienced in my life, and it was. Anyway, they gave me my first vehicle was a Dodge, and it was a 1965 3/4 ton. It was an old hatchery truck, 2-wheel drive, with a gym top canopy on it, and the tailgate was broken, so it didn't have a window on the back tailgate. It had a spotlight, but the spotlight wasn't red, and back then we didn't have blue lights, we had red lights for enforcement, and no radio, and it had an old 6-cylinder engine that was really tired. So that was my first vehicle. And I drove that back to Auburn, and then they called me about 2 weeks later and said, hey, we found you a car. I was perfect. So it was that was 75, so it was a 71 AMC, but it had a radio, it had lights, and it had a siren. I thought, boy, I'm a game warden now. So I took off and I drove the short distance from the Fairview office down I-5 to the Auburn exit, and the vehicle changed lanes on me without me touching the wheel 3 times at 70 miles an hour. I got it home, and I called the captain, and I said, Dwayne, you need to send somebody to come and get this car. I'm not driving it. It's not safe. He asked me what had happened, and I told him. And he said, oh, let me see what I can find. So a couple days later, he showed up with a 1972 Plymouth Fury 3. And back in those days, we got whatever the enforcement contract was, and then they were generally the state patrol contract. So instead of being a white car, they were green cars, dark green cars, or light green, but most of them were dark. And everybody had cars. Nobody had a 4-wheel drive pickup in those days. So he shows up interesting enough, I'd had a car just like that when I worked for Kelso. So I knew all about this car, and it had a big V8 engine, had a 383 in it it was a screamer. Anyway, so it had 120,000 miles. I found out later that Bill Streeter had driven it on Whidbey Island and got T-boned at an intersection and bent the frame, but they straightened the frame and rebuilt the car. But it drove down the road. It was a good car. And I had 250 miles when I traded that one in. And I got a 74 Plymouth Cornet, or Dodge Cornet, and that was okay. And then I finally got my new truck in 1978, and it was a 4-wheel drive. By that time, we'd started transitioning over. And I back up just a little bit. I was stationed in Auburn for about 6 months, and the chief called me early one morning, and I always get up early. And he said, what are you doing? He's a gruff old fellow, Wally Kramer, and I said, Chief, I'm having coffee and reading the paper. He said, I need game warden in Forks. I said, where the heck is Forks? He said, you're a game warden. He said, get a map, figure it out. He said, stop at the Aberdeen office, introduce yourself, and go up to Forks. I want you to stay there for 2 or 3 weeks. This was springtime, April, early April. Back then, we didn't have, our per diem was $12 a day, and you couldn't get a motel, and you couldn't eat for $12 a day anyplace. So everybody had, game wardens had ice chests in the back of their car. So I'd buy a loaf of bread, some crackers of some kind, some peanut butter, and a gallon of milk, and some mayonnaise and cookies. Buy cookies, always had cookies. And that was my per diem. That's what I lived on. And anyway, so I stopped at the Aberdeen office. It turned out they hadn't had a game warden there in over 2 years. And Forks is not a very big community. Logging, and at that time the cedar shake business was really big and really valuable. And anyway, so I made my way up to Forks. It was about 114 miles from the Aberdeen office to the town of Forks. And I got my Class A's on. I got my tie, my long sleeve shirt, everything's military press, my boots are polished, I got my campaign hat on. I'm looking pretty sharp. So I go into the Daily Record, or the Advocate, I think that was the name of the paper up there. Anyway, I go into this paper that came out once a week, and I introduced myself, did an interview with the editor, and right next door was the police department. So I do my interview, they take a picture, and I walk out, and this logger pulls up and sees my game warden car, and he goes, "You're the new game warden?" I said, "Yes, sir." He said, "I just watched 2 guys shoot a cow elk." This is April. Shoot a cow elk out on the La Push Road. I said, "Where's the La Push Road?" I had no idea. He said, "Well, get on Highway 101, go back out here to the highway," it was a couple blocks off Main Street, and follow it out, go across the river, Salt Duck River, and you'll go by a restaurant, and then be that intersection. He said, "Head for La Push." He said, there's a big reader board out there. They're standing right by that reader board, gutting the elk out. This is 10 o'clock in the morning. Boy, I kicked the old Dodge in the tail, and I went roaring out of town, and here I came up, and sure as heck, here's 2 guys, and they're gutting out an elk right along Highway 101. And I got out and put my hat on, walked up, and they looked up at me and said, "Where the hell did you come from?" I said, "You're under arrest, boys." "Okay." I said, "Where's your gun?" "It's in the truck." I said, "Just stay right there. Finish gutting that elk out." I went and got the rifles. They were still loaded in the rig. So I unload them, put them back in my car, put them in the trunk of my car, and I get these 2 guys, and I said, they were local. I had got their driver's license. They were both local guys. I said, "You know where the police department is?" And they said, "Oh yeah, we know where it is." I said, "Good." I said, "I'll follow you. You go to the police department and I'll meet you there." So I followed them in, they got out, and Ken Bryson was the police chief from back then. And I just barely met Kenny the few minutes before I did the newspaper deal. And so I walk in, and he called the guys by name, the 2 guys by name, and I said, "Chief, you must know these guys." He said, "Oh yeah, they're regulars." I said, "Can I trust them to come back for court?" He said, "They're good," or he said, "I'll go get them." I went, "Okay." So I wrote them tickets, and they didn't even come to court. Back then it was, I think killing an elk out of season was only $250. It wasn't very much money. Or maybe it was back then. But anyway, they both forfeited bail. They didn't even come to court. And they called me when it was done, and I gave them their rifles back. And turned out I dealt with them on a pretty regular basis, but never for shooting a cow elk again out of season. And anyway, sorry to digress. I got my brand new truck in 1978, and in 1979, spring of 1979, Ellensburg came open, and my goal always was to get back to Okanagan County, where my great-grandpa had homesteaded, and my grandpa had been born in his family. So that was my end goal. So Ellensburg's a heck of a lot closer to the Okanagan than Forks was. Not that Forks was a bad station. When I was up there were lots of deer, lots of elk, steelhead, salmon. And when the clam tide was on, I had more friends than I ever imagined that wanted to come up and I'm not a clam eater, but I like to dig them. So the limit was 15 a day then. I have no idea what it is today, but it was 15 a day for the night. And they were all nice big razor clams. They were all 7-8-inch razor clams. So I go out and get my 15 razor clams and I give them to whoever was there, and they'd stay for 2 days. You could have 2 days limit, and then they go home with a whole bag full of clams. And they call me the next time there was a clam tide. But anyway, it was a good station, not very many people. They had a big going away party for me when I came to Ellensburg, and I always give them a hard time, and I told them they just wanted to make sure I was leaving. Mm-hmm. But anyway, I came to Ellensburg in July of 1979, and turned out it was a really good station. It was a nice community to live in. Good people. There was a lot of deer, a lot of elk, a lot of game birds, a lot of chuckers. We had a game farm here that was raising thousands of pheasants that were released here and all over the state. So as a game warden, I got to do a little bit of everything. I got not only it wasn't like today. You did everything. You helped the biologist, game biologist, with surveys. You kept creel census from when you checked fishermen. All that stuff was turned in on a weekly basis during the season. And then in the off season, it was site frequency. We had a regular form. We did site frequencies with game bird broods and with deer and elk, fawns and calves, with antlered animals, and we made season recommendations. It was more like Wyoming and Montana, and I think Wyoming still is, I'm not sure, and Montana used to be. I don't know if they are anymore or not, but the department took a lot of weight on what the game wardens recommended. And that's because the game wardens worked with the biologist, and just like we did here, and because we worked with the biologist, we could talk about upcoming seasons and stuff, and we weren't one coming from left field and the other one coming from right field. It was a joint recommendation, and Olympia would listen to the regional folks about the seasons that were going to happen in their area. So enforcement was important, but it wasn't the only thing that we did. We worked a lot with the community. That's how I got to meet the folks from the Kittitas County Field and Stream Club. And the first meeting I went to, I thought I was going to have to fight my way out. There had been 2 game wardens here, my predecessors, that didn't have very many people skills. And a game warden just wasn't a very nice place to be in the Kittitas County, in Ellensburg. And anyway, we got over that. I worked real close with the club, and they worked real close with me. And that community affairs, in my opinion, is a big part of being able to do a game warden job, because you're one person. And in fact, in my early career, I had the whole county for over 2 years. Now when I retired, I had 4 officers in Kittitas County. I had 2 in Yakima County, and when I got promoted to sergeant, I had 4 in Chelan County. So I supervised 3 parts of 3 counties. So I had I had 10 officers working for me. And at that time, community affairs was a big part of it. And some of my guys were really good at it. Majority of them were, and some of them weren't at all. And you could tell that when I go work with them. We check somebody, and we get done checking them, and I go, "What's he do?" "I don't know." "Did you ask him?" Anyway, so the job has changed a lot, but I had a good career. I spent a little over 6 years on the police department before I went to work for the game department, and then it became Department of Wildlife. And then in 1995, I think it became the Department of Fish and Wildlife when we merged with state fisheries. And about the time I was getting ready to retire, in 2003, the old chief had retired, and generally our chiefs had worked their way up from a game warden all the way up through rank, to a sergeant, to a captain in the region, and then up to a captain in Olympia, or assist deputy chief, and then they would become chief. And that wasn't happening in 2003. And in fact, in 2002, we got a chief that had retired from the State Patrol office. He'd been a major or a general or something high up in the State Patrol, and I could see the direction that we were headed, and I enjoyed my career, every bit of it, and I wasn't ready. I started my early career as a police officer, working traffic and doing that kind of work, and I didn't want to end it that way.
Yeah.
So after 28 years, I retired as a sergeant from Fish and Wildlife, and not a bit sorry. I absolutely love my job.
Yeah, you were, one of the things that you didn't mention, you mentioned the community work. You were well known, widely respected among people I talked to for your work with kids and young people, even those who'd made a mistake. There was some way you dealt with them that they came out better people. So do you have any stories about that, or how you might have dealt with that stuff?
You know, Jim, it's my whole career. I think I only encountered 3 people. I mean, you always hear, well, it would be okay if somebody killed something out of season, poached it, if they needed the meat. And I think I only had 3 encounters with families like that. And the last one I had was here in Ellensburg, and they did need the meat. And the guy shot a cow elk. His wife had a tag. She wasn't with him. She was at work. And he took her tag and shot a cow elk. And anyway, I found out about it. I knew who he was. And I went and interviewed him, and he told me that he did. And I said, well, this is pretty serious. I said, I'm going to take this information and present it to the prosecutor. I'm not going to issue a citation right now, but I've got to take your elk. And I said, I'm going to take your rifle and hold it as evidence. I'm not going to ask for it to be taken, confiscated. I'll return it when the case is done, but I'm going to go talk to the prosecutor about it. And I did. I went and talked to the prosecutor about it, and by that time, I think the fine and the bail was $650. Far cry from what it is now. But that was a lot of money for somebody that didn't have any. And they had 2 kids. They had a son and a daughter one was in grade school and the other one just started junior high. So I went and talked to the prosecutor. I explained everything to him. And he asked me what my recommendation was. I said, well, I've taken his elk. I'm going to return his rifle, but it can't be free. I said, so why don't we charge him? And at that time, we had a statute that was violate rules and regulations, and it packed a $100 fine. I said, instead of writing a closed season big game elk case, I said, let's just write for fail to obey regulations and the $100. And he said, okay, that's what you want to do. And I said, it is. And so I went back, and the guy's name was Bobby. I went back and talked to Bobby and gave him the $100 citation, told him, and returned his rifle, told him what was going to happen, and he thanked me for it. And that's just the one that right off the top of my head that I can remember. Kids, I always liked kids. you know, and every now and again I'd run into some little guys that fishing was really good, and they'd have more fish than they were supposed to have. And I think fish back in those days, it was for kids under 15, there was a 5 fish limit, and adults was 8, and sometimes they'd have double that, you know, but fishing was good. Back, you know, most of the places they were catching fish, it was right after we planted them. Well, the department planted fish for people to catch, so it wasn't like it was a big resource loss. So I'd visit with them and tell them they shouldn't do that, and as they grew up, they got to be pretty good friends. Mm. Yeah.
So I have a question, going back a little bit. What happened to Bobby's elk?
I took the elk, and when I first came to Kittitas County, Bob Barrett was the sheriff, and they were having trouble keeping their jail in the black. Meat was so expensive even back then for beef and stuff. So I talked to Bob, and I said, hey, can you take illegal animals, deer and elk, bear, whatever I come across? And he goes, well, we'd have to have some way to process it. I said, yeah, I think I know a place. So I had a locker rented at Valley Locker on Main Street. It isn't there anymore, but it was just above, between 3rd and 4th on the east side of the street. I went in and talked to the guy's Jim, and oh gosh, I can't think of the other guy's name that owned it. And I said, so if I or the sheriff's office brings an animal in, can you process it for them? I said, we're trying to get them free meat so they can keep the jail in good food and keep their budget in the black. And they went, yeah, we can work something out. So they came up with a really good deal for it was so much a carcass to process it, and made the sheriff happy. And pretty soon he found an old International 4-wheel drive pickup truck, and he'd have his trustees, and he originally had a reserve that would go with him. And when I'd call, I'd generally get, like elk season, I'd get it out of the hills and get it to the end of a blacktop road. And then they'd meet me and pick it up. And road kills, I got the state patrol when they had a road kill, or the county road department. If they had a fresh road kill that wasn't mangled, they'd call the sheriff's office. The guys would jump in their old International 4-wheel drive truck, and they'd go out and process the elk. And in fact, if you look on the west side of the courthouse right now, where there used to be a tree out there, and that was the hanging tree, and you never knew what kind of a carcass was going to be hanging in that tree when you drove by it early in the morning on Main Street. But the trustees would skin it. It was gutted before they got there. They'd skin it right there, and then they'd take it down to Valley Locker, and Valley Locker would process it for us. So that's the arrangement, and that's what I had with the sheriff's office up until the time I retired. I don't know what they're doing now.
Yeah. I think they're still getting some illegal kills, but
yeah,
not sure exactly who's handling that.
Yeah.
So you did actually interact with kids quite a bit, and I know you did a lot of education. I know, in fact, you've been involved in hunter safety training since the 60s, if I remember.
No. Hunter education came to Washington in 1957. My grandpa took me to the class in 1958. I was 10 years old. I started teaching hunter education in 1974 when I was at the police department.
So I was only off 10 years.
10 years, yeah.
But I like my story better. You know what? Tell it how you want.
Yeah.
It's your story. So, any other examples of how you worked with your fellow agents, your fellow game wardens, to try to coach them about dealing with young people and focusing on education and why we have these rules and laws and so on?
You know, I did. Like Chelan County, the Wenatchee Sportsmen's Association, I went over and I got 2 of my guys involved with them, working with that club, and it was just like Kittitas County Field and Stream Club. and I encouraged the guys, and back then we could. I don't think the officers can anymore, but it didn't used to be a big deal to have somebody, especially if you were doing something that you knew wasn't going to be dangerous, just a routine patrol out checking fishermen or even checking hunters. And I was lucky enough in Kittitas County when I came, because I came in July. I'm the only one here in July. And this is a big county. It's got lots of public land. I think right now it's about 80 or 85% of the total land base is public land. So there was a lot of, it's U.S. Forest Service, a little bit of BLM, a lot of Department of Natural Resources, and a lot of fish and wildlife land. And there's roads in all of it.
Yeah. And
there's wildlife in all of it. And I had a couple of guys, Les Sorensen, who was a lieutenant for Ellensburg Fire Department, avid elk hunter and deer hunter, and he rode with me opening 3 or 4 days of elk season, and it was a big help having those guys and other people in the community. That would take me around, or I had one guy in particular, Delmer Nickel, who passed away now. He was a few years older than I am, and he had a Jeep, an old CJ5 Jeep, and he was born and raised here in the valley, avid hunter and fisherman, and Delmer knew the whole county like the back of his hand, and he showed me things that there's little trails getting into the Nanum that nobody else knew about it, I don't think. And I couldn't get there in my pickup truck, but he could dang sure get there in his Jeep. And at least I knew they were there. And I mean, just people like that in the community, and this, it was just real lucky. I had a couple guys that just, you meet somebody and they walk up and say hi and you want to hit them. I had a couple guys like that. I mean, they weren't bad guys, they weren't bad officers, but they just didn't have the right personality to be in enforcement. But there they were, and I had them. That's just human nature.
Yeah, it is. Welcome to the planet.
Yeah.
So, you've been retired for a few years now. You have mentioned that you really were happy to retire at the time because the changes in the department now, of course, we've talked about this many times, all of the game wardens are law enforcement officers. And in fact, on a lot of the game warden uniforms, on the back it says police.
Yes.
Which is a little different perspective than what we've often talked about wanting to be able to be involved in educating people and helping them understand why we're all out there and what we're doing. Is there one thing, just to wrap this up, that's been very interesting, I appreciate your time. Is there one thing you really miss about being a game warden?
I miss, yes, I miss being in the hills every day.
Yeah.
And I really miss conversations with people that I didn't know, that I met for the first time, because I don't know how many times during the hunting season they'd say, "You're the first game warden I've ever met in 30 years." And I went, "Well, there's not very many of us to go around." And I checked their license and have a great day. Said, "Guy, I hope I see you again." And if they had a tag, and maybe, especially first-time hunters, and the people like Deborah, my wife, says, we're only a latte away from King and Pierce County. So we have a lot of folks that applied for tags. I'm sure they still do, but at the time I was working, they applied for special tags and had never been here to one of the units that they'd applied for. So now they've got one, or their son or their wife. And if I run across those people, I get calls from them. Our phones were always in the book, so people knew how to, not like Wyoming where it says game protector and the state pays for your phone. But our phones were always listed, and it didn't take very long. And eventually we had, the state had business cards printed for each of us, and it would have your phone numbers on. And you know, it's a different world out there now, Jim. I don't think I'd like to be an enforcement officer of any kind in this day and age. You know, I don't, some of the things that I did probably weren't kosher, maybe. But I'd hate to have a camera taking a picture of what I was doing all the time. And you know, on the other hand, we didn't have GPSs, so it's a lot easier for a new officer coming into the area, and they pay for Onyx, one of the GPS programs, which is really a good program. I have it on my phone. It tells you ownership. I wish I'd have had that when I was working, because what I find in this community and every place I hunt in the state, there's a lot of private land or public land that's posted private. And if you didn't know that that was public land, I mean, you drive up the sign and I'd see no trespassing sign, I'm gonna turn around and leave. But now I turn on my phone and I look at Onyx and go, no, that's Department of Natural Resources, or that's Forest Service, you know. But I mean, there are tools, and the safety of the officers is so important. You know, their trucks are tracked, I'm pretty sure. They all have GPS, and when they check in service, somebody knows where they are. And if there's something happens, it doesn't take very long to get help there.
Yeah. Well, it's a different time.
It is.
But you set the stage for the wardens and officers, game officers who are here now. So thank you for that.
You're welcome.
Thanks for the visit. I really appreciate it. Some of this I didn't know, and we've known each other for decades.
Yes, we have.
Thanks for your time.
Yes, sir, Jim.
Really appreciate it, Bill. And we will see you next time. Don't forget to check our webpage, www.oldfartsoutdoors.com. There you will find clothing items, columns that I wrote over some 25 years, and a lot of other information that you will enjoy. Links to the other episodes that we've done and so on. But in the meantime, take a look, enjoy yourself. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time.
Old farts, good old farts, and there's nothing that we ain't done. Hiking, hunting, and fishing, we're still looking for more fun. So just sit back and listen. You don't want to be missing the adventures yet to be from folks like you and me. We've been up and down the trail a time or two. Now we wanna share these stories with you. We might be old, our wisdom's good as gold, so here are just a few. Yeah, we're old farts, good old farts, nothing that we ain't done. Hiking, hunting, and fishing, and we're still looking for more fun. I guess we ain't quite done. We ain't quite done.